Morning all, Brian S. Pratt here. Gonna read chapter 19 of Shepherd's Quest, book 1 of the Broken Key Trilogy. A little recap. Bart and Chad are in a pickle. They opened a door, they saw a chest, they walked in, the door shut behind them, now they can't get out. They're trapped. Bart can't get them out of there. And they're in Algoth, the ruins of Algoth, where goblin totems have said it's death to be. Night has fallen. Ryan's getting concerned. He can't find them. Him and their new companion Kevik, the apprentice magic user, are wondering where the heck these guys are, and they're getting worried about them, and their minds are playing tricks with them. And yeah, it's getting a little stressful for Ryan right now. And so here we go, chapter 19. We're gonna see if they can locate these two wayward fellows. Where are they? Ryan asked. A quarter hour had passed since their return to the hall, and he was growing worried. Chad and Bart should have returned by now. Maybe something had happened to them, suggested Kevik. I don't think so, replied Ryan. We would have heard something, a cry at the very least. Ryan stood by the window, anxious now that the sun had all but disappeared. Gazing at the sky, he saw the first star of evening. I had first star of the evening. First star of evening. I think that sounds better. Flows better. We better go look for them, he finally said. Let's take a lantern with us, advised Kevik. It's going to be dark soon. Good idea, agreed Ryan. Returning back outside to where the horses were tied, he retrieved his lantern and lit it. He then made his way back into the building and nodded to Kevik. All right, let's go find them. From their experience of searching the upper floors, they knew the building was large and it would take some time to completely search every room. I hope they don't return while we're gone, Kevik said. I hope that they do, replied Ryan. At least they would be all right. He held the lantern up high as he gazed at the ground. With all the times he and Kevik had crisscrossed the hall, it was hard to determine which way Bart and Chad had gone by the footprints in the dust and dirt. He was quick to realize that this was getting him nowhere and began examining the hallways and rooms to see which way their path led. There were two places where footprints were clearly visible. One was a hallway and another was a room. He couldn't help but remember the times he had to hunt for Blackface when he wandered off. There were times when that stupid sheep would make any noise that would help him in finding him. 9 times out of 10, Blackface would be found contentedly munching the leaves of the berry vines he liked so much. Which way? Kevik asked. I'm not sure, replied Ryan. Putting his fingers to his lips, he whistled loudly 3 times, just as he would to call his sheep. After the third whistle, they held still to listen. Silence was all they heard. Silence was all they heard. Can you actually hear silence? Because silence isn't sound. Silence is the absence of sound. So, silence was all they heard. Is that an actual statement? I mean, is it? Because you can't hear silence. You can hear the absence of noise, or you can be aware of the absence of noise, but you don't hear the absence of noise because you don't hear anything. I know, my brain. Sometimes it just goes off on a tangent. Sometimes I'll try to rein it in. Come on, Ryan said as he entered the hallway. The trail was clearly visible, and they had no trouble in following it. At the first doorway, they saw 2 sets of footprints, one entering the room and another leaving. They followed the trail as it went into the room. Inside, they found where Chad and Bart had rooted through the dirt and leaves before leaving. With no other exit and the entirety of the room clearly visible, they stepped back out into the corridor and continued on. Room after room, the path of footprints led them onward in their search. Each room they came to, they made a quick search. They made a quick scan to be sure Bart and Chad weren't there before continuing on. When a room held another exit, such as the door or hallway, Ryan would try to determine which way the tracks went. Whichever way they led, he and Kevik moved to follow. Bart finished checking the door for the 3rd time. There was no handle or keyhole on this side. He even went so far as to wedge his knife in the space between the door and the door jamb to try and pry it open with the blade. He felt the door move slightly before the locking mechanism stopped it. There's no way out, he said as he gave up and turned back toward Chad. Chad stood with the tube lantern in hand. He had held it to give Bart light with which to work. Now what? He asked. Wait for Riyan and Chadric to find us, he explained. Though as big as this place is, it would take some time. Maybe you could take a look at the chest, suggested Chad, seeing as how we're not going anywhere for a while. Chad's always looking for treasure. Sure, agreed Bart. Stay just behind me and shine the light on the lock. He took out his lockpicks and selected the two he normally used on locks such as these. Up a little, he said, when Chad had allowed the light to droop down too far. You need to hold it steady and level. If you hold it at an angle, the candle will burn off-center and the wax will melt all the faster. That kind of ingrained in me because we have a lot of power outages here, and you really need to hold the candle straight or it burns way too fast. Bart worked on the chest while the light wavered at times in Chad's hand. He found a trap and quickly disarmed it. It was a rather simple trap, a variant on the prick of poison, where instead of coming out and pricking, this one would actually shoot out. Once the trap was taken care of, the lock itself was easy. A few moments later, Bart was putting his picks back in the rolled leather carrier. Then while Chad held the light, he opened the lid. Immediately upon opening, the light from the tube lantern was refracted by the 24 gems held within. Not only gems, but a large pile of coins as well. There were a multiple of bright, shiny coppers with many of the silvers mixed in. But what drew their attention were the golden coins. Larger than the silvers, these gold coins were stamped with the same symbol and face as were the copper and silver coins. Bart picked one up and held it in the light. This has to be worth quite a bit, he said. Then he gauged its weight as it laid in his palm. Easily twice the weight of one of our own gold sovereigns. Oh man, Chad said as he came forward. Also in the chest were 3 identical bottles, a scabbard with a knife's hilt sticking out, and a 3-inch long ivory tube. Chad took one of the potion bottles and held it up to the light. He grew excited when he saw there was liquid still inside. Bart grabbed the scabbard with the knife. When he removed the knife, to his astonishment, he found the blade still serviceable. No trace of rust marred its surface, and when he ran the edge along a finger, discovered that it still when he ran the point, the tip along a finger, discovered it was still had an edge. I didn't want edge, ran the edge along a finger, and it still had an edge. I did not. Can't have the same 2 words describing the same thing in the same sentence. I think my OCD comes into play during that point. But putting his bloody finger to his lips, he worked to stop the blood while he tucked the scabbard with the knife safely held within into the waistline of his trousers. The ivory tube, now that was definitely odd. It had writing inscribed upon it, and one end looked as if it would pop off. Chad held it in his hand. What is this? Not sure, admitted Bart when he moved closer to look at it. It may hold something, though. He then pointed to the end that could come off. Removing this end might open it. Should I? He asked. Bart shrugged. It's up to you. Chad contemplated whether to open it or not for a moment before handing the tube lantern to Bart. He held the ivory tube vertical. Yeah, I better put ivory in there because we got the tube lantern. So we got too many tubes. We got to differentiate them. He held the ivory tube vertically. Yeah, vertically. I have it vertical, but it should be vertically. And gripped the end. Carefully twisting the end, he was pleased to feel it turn in his hand. Emboldened, he twisted and pulled the end completely off. Well, asked Bart when Chad looked into the hollow opening. Not sure, he replied. Maybe something in here. He cupped his other hand and brought it to the opening to catch whatever might come out as he slowly up into the tube. He slowly tipped the tube on its side until 3 small granules of white crystal spilled from the end and landed on his palm. He then raised the tube back in an upright position and placed the end back onto it. Holding his palm up to the light, he asked, "What are these?" "I've never seen anything like this before," Bart said as he took a closer look. All of a sudden, it looked as if the crystals turned into liquid and sank into the skin of Chad's palm. No sooner had the liquid disappeared than his hand went numb. The numbness rapidly spread outward from where the liquid had entered his skin. Bart! He cried as he started shaking his hand. What's wrong? Bart asked as he saw Chad shaking his hand and rubbing it on his pants leg. I can't feel my hand, he cried hysterically. Bart grabbed the wrist of the affected hand and stilled his thrashing. There were no discolorations or swelling as one would expect from a poison. He poked the palm with his finger. Do you feel that? No! Exclaimed Chad. Fear of what may be happening caused him to blurt it out with more feeling than he had intended. My wrist is growing numb now too, he said in a slightly calmer voice, though there was still an undercurrent of fear audible. Chad's eyes grew wide as he saw Bart set the tube lantern on the floor and then remove his belt knife. What are you going to do? Prick your palm and see if you feel it, he explained. That's a guy thing. We're going to poke it and see if something happens. Chad tried to pull back his hand from the knife's point, but Bart had too strong a grip. Hold still! He brought the tip to Chad's palm and pricked it. Did you feel that? He asked. Shaking his head, Chad said, no. A small drop of blood welled out from the wound. Bart began pressing Chad's skin as he worked his way from his palm, past his wrist, and up the arm. By the time Chad said he could feel what he was doing, Bart had made it midway up the forearm. I think it stopped spreading, Chad said. He then tried to flex his fingers, but couldn't. Then he concentrated hard as he worked to flex his fingers and only managed a small twitch from his forefinger. With a panicked look, he turned his gaze to Bart. He held up his hand and practically screamed, I can't move them. Poor Chad. They had been following the trail lit by Bart and Chad for a half hour now and still hadn't come across them. Do you think they might have left the building? Asked Kevin. Ryan came to a stop as that possibility hadn't even crossed his mind. Man, I hope not, he said. The thought of having to search for them in the dark ruins outside sent a shiver down his spine. I doubt that they would have gone anywhere. Lowering his voice, Kevin said, maybe it was whatever the totem warned us about. Maybe it has already got them. A chill passed through Ryan at his words. Now, don't start talking like that, he told him. They are here somewhere. Then why haven't we found them yet? Replied Kevin. I don't know, Ryan said. Then with conviction, he said once more said. But they're here. As he left the hall and proceeded down to another room, the shadows began to have a more ominous feel to them. Scenes of what could have happened to his friends played through his mind, none of which offered him any comfort. At the entrance to the room, he noted that the trail of footprints they had been following didn't extend past the doorway into the next room. Rather, they entered the room but didn't come out. It was a fair-sized room, similar in nature and size to the ones they had already checked. At the far end of the left wall stood a sturdy door. They did a quick check, found the door to be locked, and re-entered the hallway. Then, just as he had done a dozen times in the last half hour, he blew 3 sharp whistles. Did you hear that? Asked Chad. He was sure he had just heard 3 whistles, reminiscent of the ones Ryan would use to call his sheep. Hear what? Asked Bart. I think it was Ryan, he replied. He moved to the door and began pounding on it with his good hand. His other hand was still numb and hung at his side. Fortunately, the numbness still hadn't traveled any farther than midway up his forearm. Midway down his forearm. I think down would work better. Ryan, he yelled. Bart came next to him and added his efforts in banging on the door. Ryan was about to walk from the room when an ominous thumping began to be heard. In the state that he was in, what was beginning to believe that something malign had taken off with his friends, the bang sounded to him like the whisper of heartbeats from those long dead. The telltale heart, right? It's coming for us, he said. Fear began taking a hold. His imagination suddenly kicked into high gear. It was only tightened fear's hold on him. Kevin drew close to him as he too heard the thumping of the telltale heartbeats. Ryan's fear was contagious, and he yelled, We've got to get out of here. Fleeing down the hallway, they ran as fast as they could and didn't stop until they were back in the large hall by the entrance. When they neared the door leading outside, they came to a halt. I think it's gone, stated Kevin as the heartbeats of the dead could no longer be heard. Ryan nodded as he worked to quiet his rapidly beating heart. That was close. He glanced in the direction of the mouth of the hallway from which they had just escaped. The part of the ground floor they had yet to search still lay down that hallway, beyond where they had heard the heartbeats of the dead. Outside, night had fallen with a vengeance. The stars overhead gave an eerie feel to the ruins, and his imagination began working overtime once more. When he thought he saw a ghost passing from one building to the next, he quickly turned away from the window. It's not real, he told himself. Then he forced himself to look out again and found the ghost was gone. Are you okay? Asked Kavik. My imagination is running away with me, he said. Rather unnerved right now, he took a few deep breaths and tried to calm himself. He realized he wouldn't be good for anything if he continued to let his fears control him. Turning toward the hallway, he steeled himself to re-enter it again. He must be brave for his friends. Just to reassure himself, he cast a look outside once more and was relieved when his imagination didn't manifest another ghost to haunt him. We're going back, he said with conviction as he glanced at Kavik. All right, Kavik said with less courage than Riyan was displaying. Riyan took a moment to remove his sling and ready a stone within his cup. Though what the good that would do against ghosts, spitters, and spectrals, seriously. But you do simple things like that, things that you're comfortable with, to give you courage. Then with lantern in one hand and sling in the other, he crossed the hall and entered the hallway. Behind him, he could feel where Kavik was gripping the back of his shirt. When they drew near to the spot where they heard the heartbeats last time, he paused and listened for a moment. He sighed in relief when the heartbeats could no longer be heard. Maybe it had only been his imagination after all. Coming to the doorway of the last room they searched, he again saw where the trail of footprints ended. The floor of the hallway extending past the doorway looked as if no one had been on it for ages. They entered this room, he said, then vanished. He again looked at the door he checked the first time, the one that had been locked. Other than the one he and Kavik were standing at, and the window, it was the only other possible way out. He was certain they wouldn't have gone through the window. Then his gaze settled on the door, and he stood there and thought for a moment. Maybe it wasn't spirits we heard, he said to Kavik. Entering the room, he crossed to the door. Maybe it was a pounding of fists on the other side of this door. Now that fear no longer held him in its grip, he could come at this with more logic and less emotion. He came close to the door and whistled 3 times loudly. No sooner had his third whistle ended than banging could be heard coming from the other side. Moving his mouth right next to the door, he hollered, Bart! Chad! Are you in there? The response was muffled by the door, but he distinctly heard them say, yes. Heard them reply. Yeah. The response was muffled by the door, but he distinctly heard them reply, yes. That sounds better. Riyan grinned and turned to glance at Kavik. We found them, he said. Then he sobered up and added, there's no need to tell them we ran away the first time thinking they were ghosts or anything. Kavik nodded and returned his grin. No problem there. Turning his attention back to the door, he tried to open it. It's locked, he hollered to those on the other side. It's locked, he says, Chad said sarcastically to Bart. Of course it's locked, he yelled through the door. If it wasn't, we wouldn't still be in here. Get away, Bart said as he pulled him from the door. You're not helping any. Chad gave him a less than pleasant look as he came to stop 3 feet from the door. Riyan, Bart yelled. From the other side, he could barely hear Riyan reply. Yes? You have to open the door from your side, he hollered. Do you understand? A moment's quiet, then he heard, yes. He and Chad stood there for a moment and then heard thudding noises coming from the other side. Bart glanced at Chad and shook his head. I think he's trying to smash through by running into it. Isn't the door a bit strong for that to work? Chad asked. Exactly, Bart replied. He waited until another thump came, then hollered, Riyan! Yes, came the reply. That's not going to work. You'll have to pick the lock, he hollered. There was another moment of silence, then he heard Riyan ask, with what? Bart took a moment to try and think of what Riyan might have that would work. Unfortunately, his lockpicks were with him. You'll have to use your knife. Okay, replied Riyan. How? Realizing he was going to have to talk him through it, he got comfortable. This could take a while. 10 minutes later, Riyan had a fair understanding of how locks worked. He had the tip of his knife inserted in the lock and was working more by feel than anything else. From the other side, he heard Bart ask, Do you feel the groove? Yes, he replied. It took Bart some doing, but he had finally gotten it through to him what groove he was talking about. Okay, Bart said, you have to move the tip of your knife along the groove until something stops it. Riyan very carefully moved the tip of the knife along the groove until the point encountered an obstacle. I'm there. Listen carefully to what I say before you begin, Bart told him. First of all, you have to push the metal that stopped the tip of your knife upward and slightly to the left. At the same time, you have to push inward. If you do it right, the lock will disengage and then you'll be able to open the door. All right, he hollered back. As he began, he heard Kevik say, take your time. He held the knife in both hands as he began doing as Bart had explained to him. He gradually lifted the piece of metal and pushed inward at the same time. Then all of a sudden, he felt the piece of metal resting against the blade slip off and move back into its original position. It slipped off, he hollered at Bart. That's okay, Bart assured him. Just keep trying until you have it. It was on his 6th try when he finally felt the piece of metal click into place. Almost hardly daring to breathe, he nodded to Kevin to try the door. When the handle turned and the door began to swing open, he about jumped for joy. Now, picking the lock, I've always wondered about that. And I kind of looked it up and did a little bit. Now, this, actual locksmiths and I guess thieves out there would probably say, that sounds stupid. Locks aren't that way. Well, no, modern locks aren't that way. No, but locks where Bart is in that moment that was made 1,000 years before Bart was born, maybe they were, right? Who's to say? Who's to say how a medieval locksmith in Algoth would have fashioned locks? Right? I get dinged a lot for not doing my homework. Well, sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. This sounds good. That's all that matters when you're telling a story. Experts, like my girlfriend, she's a radiology technician, right? And she laughs at movies of doctors because they'll have x-rays backwards, upside down, and they're talking about the right hand, but it's actually the left hand. And yeah, you and I probably couldn't tell the difference. And for 99% of the people out there, it doesn't really matter. But to her, she looks at it. I mean, she's seen hundreds of thousands of these over the past how many years, and yeah. So I'm sure every person has that. Mine is driver's ed instructors. I hate the way they're displayed on TV. It drives me crazy. Like take summer school, right? When Chainsaw is doing his driver's ed test, he's careening around. He wrecks the car. As a driver's ed instructor, I don't see how that's possible. I found driver's ed instructor being behind the wheel with the students one of the most relaxing jobs ever. Because I stayed focused. I wasn't on my phone. I wasn't doing something else. I was focused on what they were doing. And driver's ed instructors, they got a brake right down there. And my foot was always on that brake. They did something I didn't like, bam! I would hit that brake, scare the crap out of them, but sometimes you have to get it through their heads. So that would never happen. Like in Mr. Holland's Opus, another awesome movie. He does a driver's ed instructor, and they have scenes where his car is just flying down the road, and he's saying, stop! He wouldn't say stop. He would hit his brake and stop the car. So, I'm rambling. All right, back to the story. You did it, Bart exclaimed with a wide grin as he pushed the door the rest of the way open. Make a thief of you yet. Chad came out and actually gave him a hug. His left hand was hanging limp, and Riyan asked him about it. He explained about the ivory tube and the crystals that caused the effect. It's beginning to tingle, he said. I think whatever it did is going away. Good, Riyan said happily. Bart showed him the open chest at the far end of the room. Everything it held except for the bulk of the copper is in our packs, he said. Once they were all out of the small room, the door began to swing closed again. They didn't even try to stop it. They showed Riyan and Kevin the potion bottles, the ivory tube, and the knife Bart had taken for his own, and the gems. I had forgotten about the gems when I wrote this, apparently. As well as the gems. Like to keep everything, keep it going so that way it's in people's mind and in my own mind too, because as a writer you tend to forget things. I'm sure you've all. Oh, speaking of that, I don't know if I mentioned this before. I may have, but at some point in this book, and it's been long since fixed, but when I first published it, a reader says Riyan and Chad turned into James and Jerome for a chapter. And that was true. I mean, I was mortified, right? And so I fixed that. It cost me quite a bit because I had to fix the print book too, but I couldn't let that lie. And yeah, I mean, if you ever find if I switched names like that, apparently I switched Hikai's name to Hassan for a couple chapters. I've got that fixed. It shouldn't come up anymore, but. They showed Riyan and Chad the potion bottles, the ivory tube, and the knife Bart had taken for his own, as well as the gems. Kevik took one of the bottles in hand and caused a bluish glow to surround it. "What's he doing?" Bart asked. "He's casting a spell that will tell what it is," Riyan explained. "It's one of the few spells he's learned so far." When the blue glow disappeared, he said, "It's a healing potion." "That could come in handy," Bart said. Now, the spells Kevik can do, those were always the first spells my own magic user always did whenever I did adventures. Any apprentice magic user, they've got to have magic missile. They have to have an identification, because you got to know, even if it's just the basic, like, I don't know much about it, but it won't kill you. Even if you just know that, it's not cursed. If you can find out that, then everything else can be found out later. You just don't want to have something on you that's cursed, malign, has a So something like the not Insidious, the one with the couple who goes in and cleanses houses, Lorraine and I can't think of their name. Anyway, yeah, you don't want something like that hanging around. So yeah, magic missile and identification were always the first two spells any of my magic users ever learned, if it could all be helped. They never had the goo spell, but thinking back, I wish they were thinking back on adventures when back in my teen years. Yeah, that goo spell would have come in pretty handy. Since there were 3 of the potions, he gave one to Chad and Riyan to keep in their packs. Chad handed the ivory tube to Kevik and asked him if he could find out what had affected him. Kevik nodded, and the bluish glow enveloped it for a couple seconds before disappearing. The crystals contained within were used by healers, he explained. They would use them to deaden an area before cutting into it so their patient wouldn't feel any pain. Never heard of anything like this, Bart stated Bart. There are some leaves that do the same thing, but not to this degree, Kevik told him. This could be a derivative of something similar. He then glanced to the new knife Bart had. Would you like me to do that as well? Why not? Kevik took the knife, and once the spell had run its course, handed it back. It's imbued with magic. There are 2 properties to the magic. One keeps it sharp, and from succumbing to the elements which would ruin it, such as rust. What's the other? Bart asked. Kevik shrugged. My spell didn't get that far. Like I was telling Riyan earlier, the spell I am able to do only gives a few general items of information. I do know that it was forged several hundred years before it was put in that chest. I thank you for what you could tell me, he said. Perhaps one day I'll be able to figure out the rest. He undid his belt and secured the other knife around his waist and slid the new scabbard onto it. He undid his belt that secured his other knife around his waist, comma. That's why it was throwing me off. There was no comma there. And slid the new scabbard onto it. As he was positioning it for an easy draw, he paused and glanced back to Kevik. It isn't malignant, is it? Shaking his head, Kevik said, No, I felt nothing like that. Good, he replied. When he had the scabbard on where he wanted it, he buckled the belt back on around his waist. Now he had 2 knives, one on either side of him. The new knife he positioned on his left side for an easy draw with his right hand. Now, he said as his gaze took in Riyan and Kevik, did you 2 find anything? And that is chapter 20. So the loot's getting a little better. We got one magic item was found. I mean, just a knife, but hey, it's a beginning, right? Level 1 characters, they start small. You know, back in the crypt, they had copper coins, a few silver, a couple gems, one gold necklace. Now they have a whole bunch of gems, a lot of copper, quite a few silvers, and a few of the gold, coins. And they got and though a few crystals came out in the Chad's hand, there's still some left in there. He didn't spill it all out. He just was getting a little bit out. And then they got the 3 healing potions, which should come into effect. Healing potions, though, I've always had a problem with healing potions. Yes, I know they're great and everything, but how do they? I don't think. Okay. You get cut. You know, you splash some healing potion on, you drink it, and your body heals it, right? Okay. Now, sometimes when you get cut, things can heal improperly, right? If you don't set a bone, it'll heal crooked, and so forth. So, I've always felt that, like in battle, you get cuts, you get stabbed, right? You drink a healing potion, it heals. How does the potion know every last capillary, every last muscle, tendon, everything to be put back in the state in which it was the moment before injury? How does it know that, right? A potion is not going to be that intelligent. Sure, it helps the body heal, but the body can heal improperly. That's documented. Bones can be, you break a bone, you drink a healing potion, it's perfect again, right? No. How does the potion know exactly to the micromillimeter where everything goes? And I don't think potions work that way. I just don't think they do. Now, I think if you drink a potion and you're seriously injured, that if you need to flex, right? So that way the body starts to understand how things are supposed to work. And yeah, so that's why magic users don't really heal that well, but priests do. Priests can heal because they're not the ones doing the healing. A superior power is doing the healing. So like their god is healing the wound in your arm or whatever. The god knows more about the physiology of humans than a priest does. A 20-year-old priest who's never been to med school. So that's why priests can heal, because they have that power with intelligence and knowledge behind it to help them heal. Magic users, on the other hand, don't have that ability. So my magic users have never healed. Yes, there are spells magic users can use that can heal, but I've always had problems with that. I mean, I'll take advantage of them in the game, right? But they don't really. I've always felt that there's a problem with that, an inherent problem with that. And everyone's gonna say, well, it's magic. Well, magic is like a computer program, and it's only as good as the person who created it. And if the person who creates a healing spell knows nothing about healing, then how can that spell heal properly? I mean, it could heal, it could save a life, it could close a wound, but will it fix every little thing so it works the same as it did before? That's always bothered me. I've always struggled with that. My girlfriend says I overthink things, and I do. Maybe that's the writer in me, but I overthink things. And yeah, like in Skyrim, you can heal yourself, which is great. I love that spell. But he shouldn't be able to do it because he doesn't know enough about healing. Anyway, I'm rambling. Just something to think about. And we'll get to chapter 20 tomorrow. At least they're reunited back in Olgoth at night. Well, we'll see if they survive the night. Y'all take care.